You're now listening to the fourth installment of Felix firing off from afar for the flyover. And with this edition, I think I'm going to start with Pope Francis's visit to the United States, which has received some media coverage. Felix thought it would be an opportune time to recover a little history and offer some analysis in the process that might throw light on some things. So, the Pope has quite understandably criticized the excesses of capitalism, and yet this is not a new phenomenon in the Catholic tradition per se, although it was historically suppressed. So we'll get into that. In 1968, there was a conference of Latin American bishops in Colombia. There they advanced the preferential option for the poor. This is cited as part of the beginning of the Latin American liberation theology movement. It drew on some of the work of critical pedagogy theorist Paulo Freire, author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, who was a proponent of anti-institucional, the elevation of a type of critical consciousness that takes account of structural forces that impede the maximization of human potential and the role of education in addressing those structural inequities. And so Freire also, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, denounced charity as a kind of false generosity because it insidiously reinforces and helps sustain structural oppression, and because it reproduces relations of power over for some and dehumanizing disempowerment for others who are forced to rely on the handouts and assume a submissive position that's socially induced by their socioeconomic position of inferiority. And it's important to note, as Freire would underscore, that those relations, they're not immutable. They can be changed. Education, which entails not just linking up seemingly separate issues to understand their interconnectedness and the need for systemic overhaul, although that's incredibly important, but it also entails action in the world to transform it and to do things differently. Denying oppressors, including the speciously generous charitable philanthropists with concentrated wealth and power, denying them that power, as it ultimately stems from our relations with each other and with the material world mediating and sustaining us, is what a kind of critical pedagogy is in large part all about. And what is necessary in order for the structural oppression that it identifies in order for that to be changed. Now, of course, I think it's worth pointing out that there are all sorts of right-wing pundits with commentary designed, or at least that has the function of protecting power and privilege at the ideological level, which has entailed denouncing liberation theology, usually through some kind of weird ideological inversion that posits it as being advanced by elite centers of power. In fact, the corporate media scaremongering laboratories that exist on the fringe and then influence the more mainstream, like, for example, someone like Alex Jones, who runs that InfoWars site, who's influenced more mainstream commentators like Glenn Beck when he was on Fox News. This is pointed out in a March 4th, 2011 article by Alexander Zaitchuk at Rolling Stone, and similar analyses have been offered by the journalist and scholar Chip Brûlé, who's corroborated that sort of interpretation. And so what has been developed at the fringe, if it's beneficial to preventing critical apprehension in the world and enabling a structural critique of problems that have many people understandably searching for answers and oftentimes scared and feeling threatened and what have you, well, then it's not surprising that it gets picked up by more high-profile spokespersons for concentrated power. And the shared disdain for liberation theology and the assertion that it's part of a nefarious scheme, that's kind of case in point. This, of course, is contrary to every bit of the historical record which Felix had promised that he would go over with you. And so the Vatican, most of the Catholic Church hierarchy vehemently opposed Latin American liberation theology, that entire movement at its inception, not to mention the significant role of the United States in backing the extermination of prominent clergy in or affiliated with the liberation theology movement. So, like as Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky point out in their book Manufacturing Consent, the highest Catholic Church official in El Salvador, Archbishop Oscar Romero, known as the voice of the voiceless, who was a vocal critic of the U.S.-supported junta government in the country, he wrote a letter to the Carter administration in the U.S. imploring the president to stop aiding the military government in El Salvador. And the Carter administration, in turn, lobbied the Pope to curb the power of Romero. And Romero was then shot a few weeks after he'd sent that letter. murdered by an assassin in March 1980. And the U.S. media coverage of the Romero case, as Herman and Chomsky demonstrated, stood in stark contrast to the extensive and qualitatively emphatic coverage given to the murder of Polish priest Jerry Popoluszko. So Popoluszko was killed within an enemy communist state that the mass media would, of course, consider proper to depict as despotic. That's sort of the internalized ideology. And Romero's murder, in contrast, received far less coverage and without the same sort of editorial condemnation. And it was instead placed within this framework of extreme left-wing and extreme right-wing violence, regretted by the Salvadoran government. The latter was a useful frame for the U.S., as El Salvador remained a heavily supported client state. And the reality, far from the media's frame, though, was that the paramilitaries and death squads in El Salvador had close ties to the U.S.-supported junta government running the country. And so Herman and Chomsky had also documented, relevant for us, how 23 prominent religious persons in Guatemala, some of them organizers for social justice, echoing tenets of liberation theology, killed between 1980 and 1985, accounted for 1/20th of the space in the New York Times combined that the paper gave to compared to the space that was given to Popoluszko. So the 23 accounted for 1/20th of what Popoluszko received. Again, Popoluszko killed in an enemy state, not a client state. So later, actually, about a year after the first edition of Herman and Chomsky's book came out, 6 Jesuit intellectuals were killed on November 16, 1989, when a Salvadoran military unit entered the Central American University campus there and shot the men and killed the priest's housekeeper and her daughter. And Salvadoran forces at the time had been trained in the United States at what was then known as the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, now called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. So a pretty significant history of concentrated power, shedding a lot of blood to eradicate currents of liberation theology and like-minded movements is not hard to demonstrate. Now, Pope Francis appears to offer a critique of capitalism that I'm sure many appreciate. Of course, he's still wrapped up within an institutional hierarchy that many anarchists understandably find it difficult to accept. The old anarchist adage, no gods, no masters, speaks to the committed rejection and steadfast challenge to the exercise of power over others that you find in many institutions. So interestingly, somewhat tangential, the folks at Crime Think have a new feature piece out titled Understanding the Kurdish Resistance, which mentions something that made me think to relate it to this whole discussion. So as is pointed out in the Crime Think article, some of the ex-military and military folks from the United States and the UK irked that their governments tricked them out of being able to fight Islamic extremists they wanted so badly to kill. They ended up joining the Kurdish People's Protection Units, YPG, and other forces in the fight for Kurdish liberation and in the struggle against the Islamic State. Only some of those military and ex-military folks quickly got out because they realized they were fighting with and alongside a bunch of atheist communists, as they understood it. The Crime Think feature actually hyperlinks to an article at an offshoot of Gawker.com, that offers more details on that whole phenomenon. Of course, it is necessary to point out that the revolution in predominantly Kurdish, largely secular Rojava in Syrian Kurdistan, autonomous regions in Syrian Kurdistan, that it's not the sort of authoritarian state communism those in the U.S. fed a staunch anti-communist ideology throughout the Cold War would be familiar with. So the depiction of the folks that the Crime Think article referred to is not exactly right. The democratic autonomy and the democratic confederalism, which is what the folks who are making the Rojava Revolution, the way they refer to their practices, looks much more like a municipalist form of participatory, commune, and assembly-based governance with women's liberation as a primary objective. And in fact, some of the military and ex-military folks from the United States and the rest of the West, like many anarchists and some socialists and other leftists, have actually warmed to the idea of democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism, and these different forms of social organization that they've seen put into practice there in Rojava and also to lesser degrees in other parts of Kurdistan. And so Like some revived liberatory currents of liberation theology, the Rojava Revolution remains a source of inspiration, I think. We can definitely continue to think and inquire as to how best to show solidarity with it as it evolves. So this has been the fourth installment of Felix firing off from afar for the flyover, and I'll be back at you next time.